The Hollow Hunger by Kyle Byram. The van rattled and groaned as it climbed the uneven dirt road, its tires spitting gravel that pinged off the rusted undercarriage. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and unease. Caleb, the self-appointed leader of the group, clutched the wheel with both hands, his eyes scanning the narrow path ahead. Could this road be any worse? Zane grumbled, bouncing in his seat as the van hit yet another pothole. Quit complaining, Caleb said without turning his head. It's supposed to be secluded. That's the point of a camping trip, to get away from it all. Zane rolled his eyes. Yeah, and by it all, you mean basic comforts like smooth roads and Wi-Fi. Some of us actually like nature, Tessa said from the passenger seat, not bothering to hide her disdain. Speak for yourself, Ava muttered from the back, her nose buried in her phone. 0 bars. Great start. Josh, the group's joker, leaned over her shoulder. Maybe the trees have Wi-Fi. You just gotta ask nicely. Ava shoved him off, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. Not in the mood, Josh. Eli sat in the far corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, silently observing the group dynamic. He was the quiet one, always on the fringe, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hinted at more going on beneath the surface. The van lurched to a stop, sending everyone forward in their seats. Here we are, Caleb announced, throwing the gearshift into park. The group spilled out of the van, stretching and groaning as they surveyed the clearing. Tall pines surrounded the area in a perfect circle, their shadows long and imposing under the waning afternoon sun. A creek meandered lazily along one edge, its gentle burble the only sound in the oppressive stillness. This is it? Zane asked, unimpressed. Where is the lake? Or the cabins? I thought this was, like, an actual campsite. It's a backcountry site, Caleb explained, pulling a large backpack from the van. No cabins. No amenities. Just us in the great outdoors. Great, Ava muttered, shouldering her bag. Can't wait to get eaten by mosquitoes. Tessa ignored the complaints and began unpacking their gear. Within an hour, the group had set up their tents, gathered firewood, and started a modest fire. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the trees in hues of orange and gold. As they sat around the fire, passing around a bag of marshmallows, the conversation turned to ghost stories. Anyone know any good ones? Josh asked, leaning back on his elbows. I've got one, Eli said, his voice low and deliberate. Oh, here we go, Zane said, rolling his eyes. Eli ignored him, leaning closer to the fire. The flames cast eerie shadows on his face, making his features seem sharper, almost otherworldly. They say these woods are haunted, he began. But not by ghosts. By something older. Something hungry. Ava snorted. Yeah, okay. What's it called? The spooky scary tree monster? Eli's eyes locked on hers, his expression deadly serious. The Hollow Hunger. The group fell silent as the name hung in the air, an uninvited guest in their circle. The fire crackled, filling the uneasy pause with its sputtering rhythm. Even Ava, who had been ready to laugh it off, hesitated when she caught the intensity in Eli's expression. What's the Hollow Hunger? Caleb asked, his voice betraying a flicker of curiosity. Eli leaned back, his face half hidden in shadow. It's an old legend. Older than the towns around here. They say this land once belonged to a tribe who lived in harmony with the forest. But one winter, the hunting was scarce, the crops failed, and desperation took hold. Let me guess, Josh interrupted, they ate each other, and now they're ghosts haunt the woods, right? Not ghosts, Eli said sharply. Worse. The story goes that they broke a sacred vow to the forest. They killed a sacred animal for food, a creature they weren't meant to touch. And when they did, they invited a curse upon themselves. The forest turned on them. They didn't starve. They just disappeared. One by one. Into the trees. The fire popped loudly, making Tessa flinch. Disappeared? Caleb repeated, leaning forward. They say the forest took them, Eli continued. Drained them of everything, flesh, blood, even their souls. Left nothing but hollow shells. That's why it's called the Hallow hunger. It doesn't just feed. It takes everything. Leaves you empty. Oh, come on, Zane scoffed, tossing a marshmallow into the fire. That's just a campfire story. Designed to freak people out. Right? Eli shrugged, his calm demeanor only adding to the unease. Believe what you want. But if you hear whispers in the trees or see shadows that don't belong, don't ignore them. That's how it starts. Whispers? Ava echoed nervously. Probably just the wind, Caleb said, forcing a laugh. Don't let Eli spook you, Ava. He's just messing around. Eli didn't respond. His gaze lingered on the trees beyond the firelight, his expression unreadable. Night fell quickly in the woods, smothering the group in darkness. The firelight created a flickering barrier between them and the abyss, but it did little to ease their growing discomfort. By midnight, the laughter and banter had faded. The group retired to their tents, though sleep proved elusive. Ava lay awake, her phone useless in her hands. The low hum of the forest buzzed in her ears, crickets chirping, the faint rustle of leaves. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A sudden sound made her sit up, a faint whisper, just outside her tent. Ava! Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She strained to listen, her breath caught in her throat. It came again, clearer this time. Ava! Come see! It was a voice, unmistakably human yet wrong in its tone, too soft, too hollow. Her trembling hand reached for the zipper of her tent. She hesitated, telling herself it was just the wind, but curiosity clawed at her. Slowly, she unzipped the flap and peeked outside. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The whisper came again, pulling her gaze toward the trees. And then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, barely visible. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side as though studying her. Ava! The voice called again, though the figure's mouth didn't move. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding like a drum. Morning came, bringing with it a strained quiet. Ava didn't mention what she'd seen. Part of her wondered if she had dreamed it. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her. When the group gathered for breakfast, Zane was nowhere to be found. Zane? Caleb called, his voice cutting through the morning air. They searched the campsite, then the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. His tent was empty, his belongings untouched. He wouldn't just wander off, Tessa said, her voice trembling. Maybe he went to the creek, Caleb suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They spent the entire day searching. As the sun dipped lower, panic set in. This isn't normal, Ava said, her voice shaking. We need to leave. Now! We can't just abandon him, Caleb snapped. Maybe the forest took him, Eli said quietly. The others stared at him in disbelief. Oh, come on, Josh said. You're not seriously blaming some stupid legend, are you? But Eli didn't back down. I told you. It starts with whispers. Then the shadows come. That night, they huddled together around the fire, unwilling to separate. Tensions ran high, their nerves frayed. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Then, just before midnight, the whispers began. They came from all directions, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Did you hear that? Tessa whispered, clutching Caleb's arm. The others nodded, their eyes wide with fear. The shadows moved, creeping closer. And then they saw it, the same figure Ava had seen. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens of elongated forms emerged from the trees, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Run! Caleb shouted, but it was too late. The figures descended upon them, their movements unnaturally fast. One by one, the group was dragged screaming into the woods. When the sun rose the next morning, the clearing was empty. The fire had burned out, leaving only ashes. Of the group, there was no trace. Only the whispering remained. When Caleb opened his eyes, the dawn light filtering through the trees felt alien. His head throbbed, and his body ached as if he'd been in a fight. He pushed himself to his feet and surveyed the campsite. The fire was a cold heap of ash, and the others were gone. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away. Just an eerie, unsettling silence. "Josh? Ava?" Caleb's voice cracked as it cut through the still air. His heart sank when he saw something glinting near the creek. As he approached, the glint turned into a familiar object, Josh's phone. Its screen was cracked, but when Caleb picked it up, he felt the sticky warmth of blood smeared on its surface. A low whimper broke the silence. Caleb turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Behind a cluster of rocks, he found Tessa. She was curled into a ball, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Tessa!" he exclaimed, dropping to his knees beside her. She flinched at his touch, her wide eyes darting to his face as if she barely recognized him. "They took them," she whispered, her voice trembling. Who took them?" She shook her head, burying her face in her hands. "The shadows. They tore them apart." Caleb knew they couldn't stay at the campsite. They had to find the others, or at least get away from whatever was out there. He convinced Tessa to stand, and the two began walking toward the creek, hoping to follow it to safety. The forest seemed alive, the trees leaning in as if they were eavesdropping. Every rustle, every distant snap of a twig, sent shivers down their spines. As they followed the creek, the water grew darker, its babbling turning to a low, menacing gurgle. "What is this place?" Tessa asked, her voice barely audible. Caleb didn't have an answer. Then they found the first body. Josh's lifeless form was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide with terror. His chest had been ripped open, his ribs splayed like the petals of a grotesque flower. Caleb gagged, turning away, but Tessa couldn't look away. That's not an animal," she stammered. "Nothing does that." Caleb pulled her away, fighting the urge to vomit. "We have to keep moving." As night fell, the whispers returned. Caleb and Tessa picked up their pace, but the forest seemed endless. They stumbled upon a narrow path leading uphill, where a gaping cave mouth loomed in the distance. The whispers grew louder, beckoning them. "We can't go in there," Tessa pleaded. Caleb hesitated, but something inside him stirred, a compulsion he couldn't explain. If they're alive, they might be in there. Reluctantly, they entered the cave. The air was thick and foul, reeking of decay. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, and the darkness swallowed their flashlight beams. Deeper inside, they found Zane, or what was left of him. His body was strung up like a grotesque marionette, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Tessa screamed, her voice echoing endlessly in the cavern. Then they saw it! The creature emerged from the shadows, its form an amalgamation of jagged bone and sinew. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its maw stretched wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The creature lunged, its movements a horrifying blur. Caleb shoved Tessa out of the way, narrowly avoiding the beast's claws. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground. Tessa hesitated, her eyes locked on the creature as it turned its attention toward Caleb. "Go!" he screamed, and she finally obeyed, sprinting deeper into the cave. The beast swiped at Caleb, sending him crashing into the wall. Pain erupted in his side, but he scrambled to his feet, adrenaline fueling him. He spotted Tessa near a pile of dry debris, old wood and bones. "Set it on fire!" he yelled. Tessa fumbled for her lighter, her hands shaking. The creature turned toward her, its guttural growl reverberating through the cave. Caleb threw himself at the beast, distracting it long enough for Tessa to ignite the pile. Flames roared to life, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The creature howled, its piercing cry shaking the very ground. It turned to flee, but Caleb shoved it into the flames, his own body catching fire in the process. "Caleb!" Tessa screamed, but it was too late. The flames consumed them both. When morning came, Tessa emerged from the cave, covered in soot and trembling. The forest was eerily quiet, the whispers gone. She never spoke of what happened, but locals who ventured into the woods afterward claimed they could hear faint cries in the wind. And the cave? It was sealed by a landslide weeks later, as if the forest itself had decided to bury its secrets. But on quiet nights, some say the whispers still linger, calling out to those foolish enough to listen.